So then I start reading about this stuff about lean metrics for complex work. We've had some lean folks on stage mention some of the luminaries in the industry who, the Poppendicks and Eric Ries and others who've leveraged lean thinking, came out of Toyota, to actually start to use them in the sort of digital and the software world. And here's a bunch of lean metrics, and there's all sorts of nonsense on that slide, by the way. I'll get to where I'm going with this. But lean metrics are used in what's called standard work. Standard work means repeatable, the same thing. You determine or identify a standard, you establish a consensus around the proposed standard, and then you rinse and repeat. You follow a recipe. How many of you are following recipes developing software? I'm guessing not so many. And then what we need to do is to make sure we understand the customer demand, something called takt time in the lean world, the work sequence, the way we do the work to meet the customer demand, and finally, how much work in process we can do, or work in progress if you prefer, WIP. You'll see that on a Kanban board in the wrong column. I'll get to that in a minute. To maintain the customer demand. That's standard work. Doing the same thing over and over again repeatedly. That's where lean metrics belong. If you're not doing that, stop using lean metrics, they won't work. And before we decide that work is complex, I need to make sure that you understand just because it's difficult, it doesn't make the work complex. And what do I mean by complex work? Well, I put this in a presentation a couple of years ago in Poland, and I suggested that all complexity in an organization is human derived. And my test for that was, if we remove the humans, is the problem still complex? Because if it's a complex problem, you can't use lean metrics. 5 why analysis, things like that do not work. And this is a simple illustration of what I mean by this. And this comes from Dave Snowden's work on Kanban. On the left, you've got football, or as everybody else in the world, well, in America you call soccer, but everybody else in the world calls football. That's non-linear, unordered, unpredictable. The team has defined roles. But the minute the whistle blows, it doesn't matter what those roles are, they're now reorganizing, communicating continuously and adapting to the emerging and evolving events to actually win the match. On the right-hand side, you've got the Toyota production system in Kentucky. That's linear, ordered, predictable, and it's got a fixed allocation of resources. Actually, the only unknown aspect there is the people, how people might react. They call them complex adaptive systems. So before you start choosing methodologies and approaches, you need to start thinking about the type of work you're doing and whether or not the measurements and the tools you're using are appropriate to that type of work. I could start talking about planning poker and points, but all your heads would explode, so we'll move on from there. So these are the actual lean metrics, and you will get a copy of these slides after the event. I'll make them available to the organizers. And I'm not going to read all these out. I'll put them on there for you to take a photograph. I'm sure they'll be on Twitter in about 2 minutes, and I will make sure you get a copy of the deck. These are the correct definitions of these metrics, not a lot of the variations that Gartner and other people are putting out there. Remember, Gartner is not a software development company. If you want to get the facts, there is a web, I've written a whole web article on this. There's the web address. If you want to go understand what these times are, how and if they apply to your world, many of them won't because you don't do standardized, repeatable processes. You're doing very variable work with emergent learning and emerging requirements. So don't use lean metrics, use something different. Your biggest challenge is something called variation. And you're in the world of variation. John mentioned it briefly on stage. So if you go back to the 1920s, and I've studied under Don Reinertson, if you're familiar with his work on product development flow, queuing theory says as you consume capacity, performance degrades as you use more of the resources. If you look at the simple illustration, you know what it's like when you're on a road and there's enough capacity for all the cars, but once the road fills up, the performance degrades and you hardly move. In fact, on 75 coming in here this morning, I had the same problem. You then get this thing called the utilization trap. There's a formula called the Kingman equation. Good luck trying to figure that out. but it is called the Kingman equation. As you start to consume resources beyond 60% of their utilization, and that's machines as well as people. So that's digital tech as well as mechanical tech as well as people. But as you start to consume resource beyond 60%, between 60 and 80%, the time it takes for new work to be processed doubles. So if you've got cards, stories, whatever you call them in your backlog, and you start to consume your team's resources, then you'll start to find the time for them to work doubles. Or the time that the new work takes before it starts doubles. As you move on and you increase that utilization between 80 and 90%, it doubles again. Now this is mathematical theory that's proven. This isn't Nigel making up a bunch of nonsense. This is actually what happens in the real world. And when you move from sort of 90 to 95%, you're doubling again. And actually the curve becomes infinite. So when there's people out there wondering why projects never get completed or things never get delivered on time, this is the reason why. You're over-consuming resources. And the reason you're doing that is because you're adding variation. Now, agility, as opposed to agile, but agility is about enabling high variation. Lots of options, lots of different ways to sort of, no, not to skin the cat, shouldn't really say that after the last conversation on stage. But variation is about giving you lots of options, lots of choices. But as you increase variation, you increase utilization. As you increase utilization, you increase work in process, you increase the time it takes for something to get done. So you're constantly balancing variation and utilization, something that a lot of corporations haven't yet figured out despite decades of research. There's something called Little's Law, and I'm not going to bore you with the detail because it would take a whole hour-long presentation. But I urge you to look into this and to take pictures of the slide or to look at it in the deck afterwards. People tend to put the work in progress limits in the column marked doing. That's wrong. You should put them in the column marked to do or your equivalent thereof on your boards or Kanban boards. You limit the work in process by limiting the size of the queue, not the amount of items a person can do at any one time. Because you're still not reducing the utilization by limiting the amount of work somebody's working on at any one time. You must reduce the queue. That's a little tip for you to take away.